Welcome and thank you for joining us on the 2020 webinar, Arts and Health, Driving Us Towards Stronger Communities. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. Please direct your attention to the poll at the left of your screen. We'd love to hear how you've been using art to practice self-care. From our national lens, we continue to see the leadership role that art and culture grantmakers are taking to improve physical and mental health in communities. A great example of collaboration, the 2018 initiative Creating Healthy Communities, Arts and Public Health in America. This collaboration between the University of Florida and Art Place America involved over 250 individuals and partners in a field scan and a 13-person working group who brought their own expertise and produced a white paper on the findings. We're glad to have 3 members of the working group and authors of the white paper joining us today for this webinar. They'll share their work, the strengths of their cross-sector collaboration, and suggestions for what arts and culture funders should consider when funding at the intersection of arts and health in 2020. David Alawuyi Fakunle is an artist and self-described mercenary for change, willing to employ any talent and occupy any space to elevate anyone who feels divested from their truest self, particularly people of color. He's on the adjunct faculty at the University of Florida Center for Arts and Medicine, this co-founder and CEO of Recover ME, and the chair of the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Fakunle's research interests include stressors within the built environment, manifestations of institutional racism in society, and the utilization of arts and culture to strengthen health, equity, and ultimately, liberation. Tasha Golden is the Senior Arts and Health Research Scientist at the International Arts and Mind Lab in the Brain Science Institute at Johns Hopkins Medicine. As a public health researcher and innovator, she studies impacts of arts, culture, environments, and discourses on health, equity, research, and clinical practice. Golden has recently presented and consulted for the National Creating Healthy Communities Initiative, Grantmakers in Health, the Trust for Public Land, and Politico's 2019 Annual Healthcare Summit in Amsterdam. She also wrote a blog post for Grantmakers in the Arts in 2019. Jamie Hand brings a background in landscape architecture, program design, and grant making to her role as Director of Research Strategies at Art Place America, where she designs and leads cross-sector knowledge and network building. Prior to Art Place, Hand worked at the National Endowment for the Arts, where she met the Art Town Grant Program, the Mayor's Institute on City Design, and the Citizens Institute on Rural Design. We're glad to have them joining us today. At the very end of the presentation, I will be joining to facilitate the Q&A. With that, I will turn it over to our presenters. Welcome, David, Tasha, and Jamie. Tasha, why don't you get us started?
Thank you so much, and thank you all for answering that question. It's really lovely to read how we're using the arts as we're getting started. And with that, I wanted to give a little background. Part of how I've been using the arts recently is playing a lot of piano. But I came to public health through a kind of circuitous path. I started my career as a singer-songwriter, and I had songs about things like domestic violence or mental illness, and quickly noticed that no matter where I was in the world, it could be Chicago or it could be Wuhan, but those were the songs that people lined up after shows to talk with me about. So I've had hundreds of people over the years tell me very personal things about their lives. I've had dozens of women in particular over the years share with me that they had, for example, experienced some form of abuse or intimate partner violence, and then follow that up by telling me that I was the first person they had ever told. And so I began to think about what that meant for their relationships with their doctors, with their therapists, with their spouse or partner, with their friends. Why were they able to share something with me, who was like a relative stranger in a music venue, that they had literally never told anybody else? So I started asking some questions like, what do we not know about a population or a group because they're unable to share their experiences in the ways that we might expect or demand? And that we can be anybody. That can be health researchers, organization leaders, politicians, whoever it might be. What do we miss when our communications can't reach across cultural difference or across trauma, or when they can't accommodate stigma or varied abilities? And I'm going right back. How might failures to gather better information be affecting our resource decisions or our health care or our policies or our services? I ran into these same questions when I founded a program called Project Uncaged. This is a health intervention for girls that are in the U.S. juvenile justice system and based on creative writing, and quickly found that the things that we learned about girls from their poems or their songs were very different than the things that we were able to learn from surveys that were administered to them, or even from just conversations or chatting around a table. They shared very different things in their art. And again, I wanted to raise those questions. What do we not know about this population? Because we have kind of just come to take for granted that they would communicate their needs or their priorities or their assets in ways that we recognize as being conventional and according to our social norms. In public health, this model that's on the screen right now has become increasingly important, this recognition that our health is determined by lots of things beyond us. So, you know, our individual genetics, our biology affects our health, yes, but so does our interpersonal relationships, our families, and people that we connect with or don't. Also our communities, the organizations or institutions that we're connected with. Of course, policies, that's excruciatingly apparent right now, the ways that health policy can affect your health and well-being. And of course, all of those things are affected by culture. For example, it's a cultural idea that health would be a privilege that you pay for versus a human right. That is a cultural premise, and so changing the culture around how we understand health or any different policy is what can drive policy change. And of course, it can work the other way around too. Changing policy can also change culture. But if we're going to be able to actually manifest differences at all levels of the social ecological model, not just the individual level, that means we're going to have to change public health and healthcare. It also means we're going to have to change research and data collection. So I want to spend just a little bit of time on that. So in a broad way, if we want to advance health equity throughout the world, we're going to have to advance structural and systems level changes. That's going to require trauma and cultural responsiveness at all levels. And to do that, we're going to need innovation and creativity, which are driven by arts and culture. So looking at the ways in which arts and culture can drive our ability to meet these various needs that we've agreed exist. James Baldwin said that the artist cannot and must not take anything for granted, but must drive to the heart of every answer and expose the question the answer hides. And for me, as both an artist and a scientist, I think that this quote applies to all of us equally. For anybody who's in this webinar right now, our definitions and assumptions, or our training and education and experience, all of those things are usually assets, but they become liabilities as soon as they start to obscure the very questions that if we were to ask those questions, we could generate transformative change. So what is it that our training and our assumptions and our norms are preventing us from wondering or asking or inquiring about that could lead to change? In 2018, I think it was, is that right? I wrote this blog for grant makers in the arts where I developed this model, sort of modeled after the social ecological model, but recognizing the different ways in which arts can affect health. So usually when we think about arts and health, we think about things like art therapy or music therapy. We look at those direct health benefits at that individual or group level. But the arts can also improve our data. They can also generate awareness and education about different issues. They can also support political and sociocultural change. So looking at a few of those benefits, arts, culture, and aesthetics can lead to changes in direct health benefits. Some of them are listed there. We can also generate more awareness and action, new opportunities for public education, and we can also increase safety and understanding, disclosure, and participation, all of which improves our data and our communication. I am just getting a notice that my network was lost and it's trying to reconnect, so I don't know if I can advance the slides, but I'm going to move forward. I'm going to focus on the data and communications piece. There we go, the data and communications piece for today, for the rest of the presentation, as soon as I can move through these. So to give you a brief example, for a recent study that I did, we wanted to find out more about girls and young women, how they understood violence in Louisville, Kentucky. So we looked at writings from them from the Project Uncaged program, from girls in the juvenile justice system. We also collected writings through a citywide writing contest with an international literary publisher called Sarabande Books that's here in Louisville. And we also collected the script from a play called How to Start a Wildfire that was written and performed by survivors of intimate partner violence at the University of Louisville. We had nothing to do with that play. We just requested the script and asked if we could include it in some research, and they gave us permission. And simultaneously with these 3 arts-based research methods, we also collected data from surveys about violence from each of these same populations and compared what we found out through all of them. And compared to the surveys, the arts-based methods where they were writing poems and songs were more culturally and trauma responsive. They were more inclusive and accessible. They identified actionable issues and experiences that the surveys had missed. They offered 30% more information about types of violence. We learned what young people thought of when they thought of violence. They offered a lot more opportunities for public engagement and broad dissemination, and I wanted to just share some of these with you. When people are, you guys know this, when people are talking about the arts, this is a human interest story. People want to hear about how people are engaging with the arts, about poetry, about who is speaking with different poems. And these stories about Project Uncaged were able to go far and wide, picked up by the AP as well, across the country. So girls' words being able to spread in a way that they wouldn't be able to share with just an article in a typical academic journal, for example. So in a general way, strategies that consider arts and culture can expand our terms. For example, the winning poem from that writing contest was about miscarriage. And when was the last time you wondered about youth violence and somebody brought up miscarriage? But these are the kinds of things that we can attune to when we open up the ways that we listen to various populations. They increase interest and trust and participation. They're also more time and cost effective than a lot of other qualitative methods. They required minimal researcher intrusion, which is so important, especially for populations that are always being asked different questions by health researchers. And they offer an assets-based approach while also providing these health benefits that we've talked about and helping shift sociocultural ideas and norms. So what are the implications of this? If we know that arts can provide us with not only health benefits, but with different ways to know people and know things and learn. First of all, for the social ecological approach, we have to recognize that culture is present in what we're looking at all of the time. So just because people don't consider art when they make artifacts doesn't mean that they're not using art. The people who made these terrible looking intake forms were applying art. They were just doing it really badly, right? People are trying to improve that approach with new kinds of forms, but the sooner we can recognize that culture is a part of everything that we do, whether it's health and healthcare or economics, the sooner we can begin to make some innovative changes. For ethics, if we know that there's a way to conduct research that can simultaneously provide health benefits, then we have to understand that when we conduct research, we are always choosing whether to offer or withhold those potential benefits, and that is an ethical choice that has to be part of the consideration that health scientists and other researchers are experiencing. And there's also implications for communications. A lot of researchers think that they have to, when they have a new question, they have to go to a population again and ask that question as if that population has never answered that question before. But of course, we know that populations are talking about their needs and priorities and assets all the time, often through the arts. And just because we don't know how to go find that or interpret it doesn't mean that we should therefore barge into a community and ask them the same questions again. It's on us to learn how they're communicating for themselves, and that can mean a lot of change. And lastly, there's some implications for funding. Sorry, having a little bit of problem advancing the slides correctly. But if we have generated funding for research, and we know that if we're generating funds for research and we know that the arts can provide sources of quality data for research and health, then it stands to reason that some of the funding that has traditionally gone toward traditional forms of research could instead be put toward arts and cultural practices. And that has its own benefits for community relationships, for sustainability, for equity, because we are, by supporting that research, we are also simultaneously supporting organizations and practices that each community already values. And just to close with Baldwin, again, he said that I don't believe any longer that we can afford to say that it's entirely out of our hands. We made the world we're living in, and we have to make it over. And one of the things I had mentioned in that blog for Grantmakers in the Arts is that the constructive nature of our world means that we can deconstruct it and we can reconstruct it, and that is the hope in all of this. A lot of the things that we accept as normal are also actually cultural manifestations of the arbitrary, and that means that we can create something different if we wish to.
All right. So it's always a pleasure to be able to share my story. And the story begins with telling you just a little bit about who I am. I know a lot of people tend to see the couple of letters behind my name and may see a lot of the things that I've done in my life and in my career. But if I were to start my story answering the question who I am, this is what I would show you. So I would show you that I am a husband. I try to be as good a husband as I can. Same with being a father. I try to do the best that I can. I am Deborah and Tyrell's son, and that will never change. I am Mary's brother, and that will never change. So these are the things that make up who I am, and I think the overarching theme, yes, I think the overarching theme of what I'll talk about this afternoon is getting to know who we are as people and the stories that we bring to every conversation, to every initiative, to every effort that we take, whether it's in arts and health or just life in general. There was once an elder woman, and every day this woman would walk through the forest. It was her sanctuary. It was her refuge. It was where she meditated. It was where she was one with the divine. On this particular day, as she was taking that daily pilgrimage, she came across a stone. And as an elder woman, she had seen many stones in her journeys, so she knew there was something special about this one. So what did she do? She took the stone, she picked it up, put it in her pouch, and she kept walking. As she was continuing on her pilgrimage, she came across a young man. And as this young man was slowly approaching her, she could see with her own eyes that he had been going through some things, because he looked tired, he looked hungry, he looked thirsty, he looked like he had been in like 4 or 5 fights. Anything that life was dealing this young man, he was coming up on the losing side every single time. When the young man finally approached the elder woman, he asked her, he begged her, "Man, do you have anything that I can eat? Do you have anything that I can drink? Can you help me in any way?" But it wasn't long until his eyes caught gaze of that precious stone that was in her pouch. And when they did, the young man was no longer tired. He was no longer hungry. He was no longer thirsty. There was only one thing that he wanted. And so he asked, "Ma'am, may I have that stone that's in your pouch?" And without any hesitation, as if she didn't take a single thought, she took that stone out of her pouch, she gave it to the young man, and she kept walking. Didn't say a word. So the young man is going in one direction, and the elder woman is going in the opposite direction. The young man is holding that stone in his hands and hasn't taken his eyes off of it for a second. He's thinking to himself, with this stone, I will no longer be tired. With this stone, I will no longer be hungry. With this stone, I will no longer be thirsty. With this stone, no one will ever dare touch me again. With this stone, everything that I have ever asked for will be granted to me. But after a while, he stopped, right in his tracks. And for the first time in his journey, he took in all that the forest had to offer. The sights, the sounds, the taste, the touch, the smell. And after a while, he turned around and he ran back to that elder woman who was still walking. And when he did, this is what he said to her. "Ma'am, I would like to return this stone to you because I want whatever it is inside of you that allowed you to give me this stone so freely." Now, this is a story that I tell pretty much any time I introduce myself to a new audience, and it's always amazing to me that no matter how many times I've told this story, and I've told it hundreds of times at this point, I always discover something new when I tell the story. Now, typically when I tell the story, it's usually about finding those special qualities, those virtues inside of you that should be the stone, the precious stones that we share with the world. And that's a totally valid interpretation of the story. But this time, it called to me thinking about the stability and fluidity of health. So we think about the young man who, Lord knows how long he's been in the forest, just escaping whatever troubles he's escaped. And in his mind, he's thinking about, I need food, I need water, I need shelter, I need protection, all these basic core needs that we as human beings definitely need. But after his interaction with the elder woman, he's thinking about what she had inside of her, and just thinking about her daily pilgrimages in the forest. I think about peace, I think about contentment, I think about joy, all these things within her mind and within her spirit that gave her all the satisfaction that she needed, so much so that when she came across something material, from a material standpoint, very valuable, she thought nothing of it and was willing to give it to somebody else if it would provide them happiness because she had what she needed. And to me, that's such a great analogy to how health is perceived, particularly in the United States of America. So when we think about the Western approaches to health, we typically think about the body. We see how it has taken such a long time for us to consider the importance of mental health and even emotional health, and yes, even spiritual health. So all these things are part of the tapestry of public health that must be considered if we really want to consider total health and well-being. But we're still struggling in many ways to take mental health as seriously as we should and emotional health as seriously as we should. And to me, being a storyteller, being a person of color, being part of the African diaspora, where my philosophy was rather different than the philosophy that I learned while pursuing my PhD in public health, it allowed me to see it from a different perspective, and it equipped me, quite honestly, to see where there are perhaps gaps in our understanding, in our epistemology, where we consider knowledge and the things important to know within our field. And because of my background, growing up at the National Great Blacks in Wax Museum, knowing the history of the black experience, from Africa through the transatlantic slave trade, through slavery, through Jim Crow segregation, and certainly the manifestations of oppression we see now, I can't help but to think about how our current pedagogy and our current epistemology within public health is shaped by those systems of oppression. It's impossible for us to separate the two. We may not know the depths to which they are connected, but they are undoubtedly connected. So the question that I have raised in my career so far is, what have we been missing? So because of this structure that so many of us adhere to, what don't we know? What don't we consider? What don't we look at as a result of this epistemology and this pedagogy that we all must subscribe to? So for anyone out there who has gone to medical school or has pursued a graduate level degree in the health sciences, you know what I'm talking about. We all probably have similar experiences. So for me, if I wanted to get those three letters behind my name, I had to understand that epistemology and that pedagogy and master it. But it never stopped me from considering the epistemology and pedagogy that I brought with me to my doctoral program. And that really leads me to how I have been breaking down the walls of the ivory tower public health style. So my training is officially in drug epidemiology. But I swear on my mother's life, who's working with my son right now on his reading and his math, most people now know me as a storyteller, even within public health. And the reason is because of how I used the Black oral tradition to address public health, be it as a practitioner and as a researcher. And again, the simple fact of the matter is I cannot separate my culture from anything that I do. It is too embedded in who I am. So naturally, me venturing into the space of public health was going to incorporate some aspect of my culture. I didn't think it would be this strongly, if I'm very honest with you. So I think of Discover Me, Recover Me, which started as a class project my first year of my doctoral program, The instructor found out I was a storyteller, and she said, you know what, for your practicum, I want you to go to a recovery center in West Baltimore and teach the client storytelling. And so I did, and it completely changed the trajectory of my public health career. So Discover Me, Recover Me is just simply using storytelling. In my case, it comes from the Black oral tradition, but it could be from any tradition because storytelling is a universal art form, and using it as a catalyst and a primer to strengthen and encourage people to tell their own story. So to the 60 participants that I'm looking at right now, and just your names only, you all have stories to tell. You all are storytellers, but I wonder how many of you have been empowered to tell your story, no matter what it is. So when I think about the first slide that I showed you, that is the story where it begins for me, who I am as a person, not the papers that I publish, not the presentations that I've done, none of that stuff, but who I am as a human being. And every single one of you has the same capability to tell that story. And in many cases, being able to tell that story and to look at the journey that you all have taken, you are able to provide yourself healing from the trauma that we all deal with. So it doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum of mental health, we all have trauma and we all deal with the consequences. And one of the first things we can do is to tell the stories of the lives that we've lived. And I've been fortunate to see how that approach, which to me as a storyteller is so simple because it's what I've always known, is so profound within public health. The opportunity for people to expand on their personal context. So one of the dirty words in public health research, and I'm sure all forms of research, is bias. And to me, bias is exactly what we need, but we don't call it bias, we call it context. So whether it's personal context, whether it's cultural context, whether it's institutional context, it is those nuances that help us to truly understand a person's trajectory in health and well-being, whether on the individual level or on the macro level, looking at whole populations. Story mapping does the same thing. So that was my opportunity to allow the people, community members, to tell their story, but to also combine it with mapping. So qualitative GIS is a relatively new field within the health sciences, but mapping the stories and allowing people to show me the assets and resources within their communities, but also giving me the context and the reasons and the rationale behind why they decided to make those markers on this map as you see. So when it comes to breaking down the ivory tower, it's not just about race. That's just one aspect. It ultimately is about power and how we reallocate power to those who can contribute to the total understanding of health and well-being. So it's not just the funders, sorry funders. It's not just the researchers, sorry me, sorry Tasha. It's not just those of us who are in this room right now, but it's the people who are living the lives that we're trying to understand and research and get clarification on that can provide necessary data, D-A-T-A, data, through their stories that will make the difference in the efficacy and efficiency of the initiatives that we aim to implement. And arts and culture is a way that we can do that. So why do arts and culture work in health? It just does. I don't want to waste anyone's time to give you the fully drawn out answer to why it works. Just think about how arts and culture has been such an influence in your lives. And looking at the answers that we saw at the beginning, that's my point. You didn't need to write a paper. You didn't need to do a presentation. You didn't need to do a PowerPoint to tell me that. Your experience is all the evidence that you needed. So arts and culture is inherent to our human experience. It's experiential. It's not empirical. So no journal is going to explain or qualify or capture what the experience of arts and culture does. So when Tasha is singing her song and playing her guitar, when I'm playing my djembe or telling a story, when anyone is painting or dancing or acting, no paper is going to capture what that moment means for not just the participant, but the viewers of that art. It is truly experiential. What I've seen in my time in public health is how arts and culture and health have been separated. But if you go to many places around the world, they're never separate. I always think about the story that Jill Sankey, a colleague out of the University of Florida, told me about when she went to Africa, I think Uganda specifically, and talking about with some of the artists there and some of the public health officials there about kind of these concepts of arts, culture, and health. And to them, it's like, you don't separate them. That's ridiculous. And you're right. And I agree. It's ridiculous. arts and culture is health. It should never be separated. So when we think about understanding, again, the trajectory of health and well-being for any population in this country or around the world, it is ridiculous. It, quite honestly, is stupid that we don't consider their culture and the practices within their communities as part of why their health is the way that it is. So when we think about the fifth wave of public health, that's exactly what it is. So we're finally getting on board, thank the good Lord. But we have a lot of catching up to do. So to me, how that focuses my work and focuses what I do, I'm not that concerned with trying to understand it in its totality, because sometimes that's just a waste of time. I'm concerned with just doing it. So if I had waited until I fully understood why Discover Me, Recover Me works, there would be plenty of people in recovery, plenty of people who are looking to address their trauma who I would have never talked to. And to me, that's a disservice. So I'll try to do my best to explain everything, but to me, my focus is just doing it. So why invest in arts, culture, and health? Let's get to brass tacks. Why do you invest in this? Because look at these numbers. So look at how much arts and culture produces in this country, the United States, but then also look at how little is invested in arts and culture. So just imagine if we thought about investing as much as we know it puts out, the work that it can do. And then we juxtapose that with how much we spend on healthcare. And what we know about in public health is that healthcare is on the back end. So there's only so much you can do when you're caring for health, but if you prevent the health challenges that require healthcare, not only does it make more sense, but it saves a hell of a lot of money. And look at that. 16.9% of $20.5 trillion. Oh, what we could do with that money if we just invested a drop in arts and culture. So we think about the United States overall. I mean, 2020 has been it's been a decade and a year. And we think about what it has done for mental health and emotional health, what it will continue to do because it's not over. Politics aside, global pandemic aside, all the disconnect and dissonance that we're experiencing aside, it has an effect on our health. And as we see, when we compare other countries around the world, developed nations like Canada and much of Western Europe, we're at the bottom. So for as much money as we claim to have, as much opportunity, as much resources we claim to have, it's not translating and actually living longer. And one of the things that Tasha, Jamie, and myself have seen is that when there's even just a little bit of intentional investment in arts and culture, knowing all the ways that it connects to health, the way we think, the way we feel, the way we behave, oh, how much money we could save. Oh, how much more life we could live if we took arts and culture more seriously. So if there's anything that I leave you all with is take arts and culture seriously, because it's a pillar of health that needs to be nurtured, cultivated, and invested in more. So how does this story end? Because I know I've been talking for way too long. First and foremost, tell your story. I would love to hear every single one of your stories at some point in my life because it's worthy of being heard. Be unapologetic about your creativity. If there is one thing that I know is that art is science and science is art. They are one and the same. It's just different languages. So you can be just as creative in science as you are in art. You're all smart. That's why you're here. So you can do it all, or at least a lot of it. So there's nothing wrong with being a top-flight scientist or certainly having all the evidence, but also having all the creativity. That's important as well. And then the last thing I want to say before this quote is that art in its purest form is equity and is liberation. So think about the ways that art has always informed the revolution, the cultural revolution, the gender revolution, the racial revolution, whatever the case may be. Art has always been a vessel by which that's been expressed. And art is such a great equalizer in many, many ways because people can tell their truth. So that is why I believe that art in its purest form equals equity and liberation. And I'll close with this. Until the lion tells his side of the story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. That is a Zimbabwean proverb, and it is the mantra of Discover Me, Recover Me, and all the work that I do as an artist and as a researcher and as a practitioner. Everyone deserves to tell their story, because when everyone tells their story and shares their truth, we get the truth.
Hey everyone, this is Jamie Hand from ArtPlace. I don't know about you, but I'm so inspired by David and Tasha, and I am just reminded how fortunate I am to get to work with minds like theirs, both their science minds and their art minds. What I'm going to do briefly here is share a little bit. I'm going to zoom out and share a little bit about sort of what it has looked like to fund arts and public health from the ArtPlace perspective, and I'll do that a couple ways. I'll do a quick background on ArtPlace's broader commitment to cross-sector work and how we've been very intentional about it for the last 6 years. And then I'll introduce the Creating Healthy Communities, Arts and Public Health in America initiative and provide an overview of a few key elements of that project, and that's, again, how as Sherilyn introduced, how Tasha and David and I have come to work together. I'll share a quick glimpse of how that initiative pivoted this spring after COVID hit and took the opportunity to create a suite of resources that make the case for the power and the role of the arts to address many of the impacts of the pandemic. And last, I'll wrap up by pointing out how I see this work living on beyond ArtPlace's sunset. For those of you who know, we've got about 9 weeks left in ArtPlace's existence, and there's some incredible investments being made by other art funders, which I understand one of the points of today's webinar is to talk about. So the quick background that I mentioned, ArtPlace's mission has been to position arts and culture as a core sector of community planning and development. When we sort of looked at that mission, this was about 6-7 years ago at this point, we created this thing on the left called the Community Development Matrix. It's basically, we are acknowledging that community development as a field is a big umbrella. There's a lot of different people showing up and doing work in communities, and that the folks that do that work are coming at it from different backgrounds, different disciplines, different industries, different ways of working. We realized that if we were going to make the case about the role and the power that the arts can play in community development, we needed to do it with some nuance, and we needed to be more precise about some of the outcomes in each of these fields that arts and culture are connecting up to. And the diagram on the right is just a sort of a footnote. It's very important for us, just to say that when we're looking at intersections, I think in the art sector we often talk about, the arts and work. I think that's familiar for a lot of folks on this call. But for us, it's been also very important to have this sort of third emphasis, which is, sometimes we say community development, sometimes we say place. The idea that this work is playing out in places, in communities, and specifically in the public health work, there's a lot of people coming at public health, but really looking at the intersection and how it shows up in communities, in zip codes, things like that. So I might need help getting back to the slides from some of the folks on the call. Everything just jumped away. I'll keep talking briefly. Just to say that in each of the sectors, so ArtPlace has used this diagram in a lot of different ways. We've used it in our grant making, we've used it in our field building work and in our research work, and specifically the portfolio that I've led, we basically took each one of those sectors and did a deep dive. We did it in a way that was explicitly participatory, and I think that's the main thing I want to leave here is just to say that our research work has not just been about sort of creating evaluations or outcomes in the traditional sense, the way philanthropy often does, but it has been as much about field building and creating a shift in practice and a shift in a way of approaching arts and culture that I think is really relevant to the conversation today. Specifically, the Creating Healthy Communities overview. For our public health sector research, I almost can't talk about this. I think David mentioned Jill Sankey. I can't talk about this work without mentioning Jill Sankey and the incredible work that she does at the Center for Arts and Medicine at the University of Florida. University of Florida has been ArtPlace's partner in the public health work for about 3 years now, and we launched this initiative basically in a bigger scale in a different way than any of the other sector work that we've done at ArtPlace. We realized that public health, as both Tasha and David have explained, as public health as a sector has gone much broader into the social determinants of health, there were so many things that we needed to tackle with this research, and the fact that the health sector was, has that grounding in a specific way of working, as David mentioned, in the sciences, in in the medical sciences, we realized that we had to do both academic research. We had to do sort of the formal evidence synthesis and reviews, and we also had to do the field building that I mentioned a minute ago. I'd be remiss if I didn't sort of acknowledge that I first met Jill Sonke at a GIA roundtable in Orlando a few years ago that was focused on arts and health. And you know, at first, I confess, I felt out of place. I felt like everyone in that room, and I sort of took for granted, was coming at it from an arts and medicine, arts and healthcare settings perspective, and I took for granted that that work was a thing, and that work was done, and that work was established. And that's, you know, more of an indication of my own greenness in arts research. But I think, you know, at one point I raised my hand. I said, look, well, the way ArtPlace is going to pursue this research, and we're really looking at sort of the community setting, back to that idea of place that I brought up earlier. And we really wanted to understand sort of how this stuff does scale out, how what we know about the arts in the healthcare setting and arts and individual impacts can scale up to arts and community settings or arts and public health. So Jill and I actually shorthand the initiative as making arts and public health a thing. That was one of the things we set out to do. And what this image is that you're looking at is sort of an overview of all of the many components of the initiative that took place over the past couple of years. One key aspect was convenings. As I mentioned, we're committed to a deeply participatory way of doing research that really centers the perspectives of practitioners, artists, those leading this work that are out there doing it, again, like Tasha and David, as well as researchers that have, you know, we're standing on the shoulders of people that have done this work for a long, long time. So you'll just see here that there's a you know, images from the different convenings that we had. There were 9 over the course of 2 years. More than 250 thought leaders from public health, arts and culture, community development were convened. There was also a survey of over 500 folks nationally. And, you know, I think one of the things that we found, I'll just reflect, is to say that when we started this work, we believed that we were trying to make the case and sort of create some momentum. And as Jill says, push the boulder up the hill. But what we found is that we were actually chasing it down the hill. There was so much of an appetite and energy and hunger for this way of working and this integrated approach and this sort of creation of new ways of doing work that we actually, it spiraled in a way that was super exciting and really refreshing to see. One of the key outputs of the initiative was the white paper that you see here. Again, this is what Tasha and David and I have all been listed as authors on. This was released in September 2019, and it brought together the dialogue, the data, the survey that I mentioned, the convenings, the additional focus groups. And what we really did with this paper was we tried to create sort of a call to arms in an effort to build some shared language and commitment to key ideas and issues at the intersection of arts and health. You'll see here that, and this is something that I will never forget, and I learned so much from this process, but this was an incredibly complex and collaborative process. You'll see here that that Tasha and David and I were 3 of 12 authors that worked on this paper. We actually all got together for a week-long writing retreat. This was about 1.5 years ago at this point. And, you know, we've got people who are in social work, neuroscience, urban planning, behavioral science, epidemiology, all represented here in this group of authors. Very intentional in terms of the balance of perspectives that we brought together. And it's also worth noting that we had 18 external reviewers as well from all of, you know, again, the full range of fields and perspectives. And to give you a full sense of the complexity, I think the fact that our final version, I think, was something like draft number 37 or version number 37 just shows how much sort of back and forth and effort that was put in to sort of get it right and to put a stake in the ground with this paper. Here you see the key themes that we lifted up in the white paper. We basically said that these were all hands-on deck priority public health issues that arts and culture can help address using mental health, racism, collective trauma, chronic disease, social exclusion and isolation, and we're going to come back to these in conversation with David and Tasha in a little bit. The slide here, just wanted to sort of pull out some of the themes that go a little bit deeper. This is sort of the what the arts can do language that is so intuitive to so many of us who are working in the arts, but we made an effort in the paper to present it in a way that really focuses on public health language and framing. I think David, again, mentioned earlier, you know, not playing the game, but sort of working within the system that public health is. This was sort of our version of that. So you can see here, arts and culture can facilitate dialogue. We all know that. But here we go a step further and talk about the safety and sense of connection created in arts and culture activities and the spaces that facilitate dialogue. It can even create dialogue about difficult issues and across difference. It can reduce stigma and isolation and increase access to care. So again, we're really trying to take issues that we know and that we see in arts and culture and connect them up to priority needs and language that the public health sector uses. Pretty importantly, I mentioned we were the white paper was sort of putting a stake in the ground about some language and a call to arms. What you see here is the beginning of an evidence-based framework that was sort of a core foundation and the scientific evidence-based framework underpinning all of the research as part of this initiative. This is so that we could cite in the briefs, in the white paper itself, and some briefs I'll mention in a minute. This, I would say, has some implications for more than just public health. It's a really exciting piece of the research that actually, anybody who's doing community-based work can see themselves in it and start to have some real evidence for the work that they're doing. Tasha, I would say, would like to mention is a key author of this framework, and it's actually going to be launched in full in an interactive version in a couple weeks. I mentioned that in the spring this year, we pivoted as the Creating Healthy Communities Initiative, and under Jill's leadership, pivoted to really respond and react to the COVID pandemic and everything that was going on. I think so many folks in our field rightly were focused on sort of the support for the artists and for the arts sector that was needed once COVID hit, which is critically important. But this was also, we felt, an opportunity to really build off of the coalition that was assembled through the Creating Healthy Communities Initiative and lift up all of the ways that artists were showing up and meeting the needs of individuals and communities in this crisis. So sort of both directions, how are the arts actually showing up and responding and sort of taking the lead in responding and providing relief to COVID. University of Florida had a huge repository of research from the Ebola crisis in 2014 and 15 as a precedent for this work. And we created a resource repository where anyone can submit, you can see the image here on the top right, anyone can submit projects that they were doing. So this is a live active resource that anybody can visit. The other images on this page are just glimpses of some resources that we created for local government and state government actors. These are advisory briefs and calls for collaboration, again, that boil down the language of all of the work that we've been doing for the past couple of years into very specific, targeted, actionable recommendations for folks working in those areas. The state brief was released with NASA, National Association of States Arts Agencies, and with NACIDA, and then the local brief, we partnered with the National Network of Public Health Institutes, National Association of City and County Health Agencies, emerging local government leaders, ICMA, and a whole bunch of others, lots of acronyms. And as I said, these things were created in a deeply collaborative way. My last slide, just to say, is that, as I mentioned, ArtPlace is sunsetting in the next 2 months, but what has been super exciting to see is sort of the way that this Creating Healthy Communities initiative seems to have been succeeding in making arts and public health a thing, and that there's so many other spin-off initiatives and efforts that are happening now and will continue into the future, long after our sunset. So on the left here, you see an image of the EpiArts Lab that is one of the NEA research labs this year that has just launched with support from the Pat Steinmetz Foundation, Bloomberg Philanthropies. It's a partnership between the University of Florida and the University College of London with Dr. Daisy Fancourt there doing an incredible study. I think this is going to be at the GIA conference featured in a couple weeks. There's a special issue of Health Promotion Practice, the Sage Journal, coming out next year, and that's a partnership between the University of Florida and the Society for Public Health Education. And the amount, the response and the submissions to that have been incredible. In a couple weeks, there's an effort led by Yerba Buena Center for the Arts with University of Florida and the National Academy of Sciences to really identify core outcomes, moving this work forward. And of course, there's critical investments that Laurie Tisch Illumination Fund and others have been making for a long time. So just to say that there's, we tried to sort of put some serious resources to this and as I said, make it a thing, but there's so many others that are investing in this area that I'm really, really hopeful about where we're headed. So with that, I wanted to sort of bounce back to the white paper itself and just say that, I just shared the quote-unquote funders' perspective on this initiative and sort of why we invested in it and what the sort of end game was for us. But I'd love to pass it back to David and Tasha for a minute to share their take on the initiative as a whole, or what it was like for you all to participate, either in the co-writing process specifically of the paper, or more generally in the overarching research and convenings and initiative. So I'll pause now. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie. This is Tasha. I'll just say really quickly that it was such an honor to work with so many different people from so many different disciplines who were all interested in this intersection. And we, and a really interesting part of the process of writing this white paper was getting on the same page with definitions. As you guys can imagine, like even how do you define art? How do you define community? And when these key issues came up that you see on the screen here, like what are these things? What are we referring to when we say these things? Because coming from different disciplines, everybody had a different take on this, and trying to establish that common ground was so important early on. But so yeah, it was the first thing that came to mind when you asked that question just now, Jamie.
Thanks, Tasha. David, any response from you? Oh, it looks like maybe he's trying to call back in.
All right. We can. All right, David, do you want to respond to Jamie before we?
Yeah, sorry about that. I guess. Yeah, I guess the universe didn't want me to answer that question, but I will. But Jamie, I'm with you. I understand the for lack of a better word, intimidation, because I definitely felt somewhat intimidated being in the working group. It happened so fast, and everything in 2019, really in my introduction to the formal space of arts and health, was such a crash course. But for the longest time, I didn't know it existed. I just thought there were people in the health sciences that had artistic inclinations or artistic leanings, but didn't know it was a kind of a formal space or an existing space. So that was an initial shock to my system, and then to go from that to being asked to contribute to a white paper, I wasn't sure exactly what I would contribute, but I appreciated the merging of philosophies and the merging of backgrounds that happened in the paper. And when Jamie talks about the different iterations of the paper before the one that most people have seen, she is not exaggerating. And one thing that I noticed was just how the language blended every time the iteration changed. So at the beginning, you could tell, oh, so-and-so wrote this, or David wrote that part, or Tasha wrote that part. But as you got towards the final product, it sounded like one collective voice. And I can admit that took me that was a shock at first for me, because I'm used to writing papers being either the lone author or the primary author, so I know it's my language. But in this case, it really was a collective piece that we all created, and that's something that I'm familiar with as an artist. So it shouldn't have been that shocking to me, but I guess it was in this case of writing a paper. So that was one part that I really, really appreciated. And yet, while it was a collective words, again, it reflected all the insights that we as individuals brought, as once we were able to, as Tasha mentioned, find a common language and come to understanding of definitions and context and just a perspective that we wanted to address with this work. So it was a great exercise in not just writing, but again, thought, and that was probably the one thing I take away the most.
That's awesome. Thanks, David. Thanks, Tasha.
Awesome. Well, we are going to kick it back over to our presenters in a moment, because it is time for our Q&A. So if you use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit questions and be specific about who the question is directed to, you should now have control of the slides if you want to go back through the presentation to curate some questions that you have. I hope you're all able to, to curate the questions that you have, and we'll get started. So the first question, it's primarily for you, Jamie, but I would love to hear from all of you. What have you found to be the primary barriers to integrating arts and public health? Whether it's a primary barrier in your work or in the people that you've worked with. Dave shared that, this is a consistent issue. I'm having a difficult time blending the two. It's so either or, and it's hard to get everyone on board to look at this as a both. So I'll direct that to you, Jamie, and Tasha and David, feel free to respond as well.
Yeah, I'll be quick because I'm actually more curious to hear what they, what Tasha and David both say, because they are artists working in public health settings, so I think they're living it on a more day-to-day basis. For me, the short answer is just it always comes down to this issue of language that David just sort of re-brought up, and really sort of, language and concepts and framing, and, to maybe deepen that answer a little bit more, to make it more than just about sort of an active translation. I do think that there are sort of deep structures, both Tasha and David mentioned this, deep structures within public health. Again, not my field. I know just enough to be dangerous in any of the fields that we've explored. But ultimately, I'm a generalist. But the sort of the reliance on evidence-based decision-making, the reliance on randomized controlled trials, the reliance on sort of very rigid and sort of traditional ways of collecting data and knowing things, that's precisely what arts and culture sort of explodes and pushes up against and says, no, there's other ways to know, there's multiple ways to approach this, and both David and Tasha spoke to that in their presentations. So I would kick over to them to see if you all have a different way of answering.
Great.
So Jamie,
go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. It comes down to language, and I think it also comes down to ego, if we're going to get real about it.
Yeah.
Because, and I think about this from the perspective of someone who's had to understand, again, different epistemologies, different pedagogies. I know how much in this society we put value on, or maybe I'll say it was an academic space, because society could be a whole nother thing. It's 2020. Everything's up in the open. So I'll say in academic spaces, I know how much value we put on these pieces of paper that we spent several years to acquire. I know how much value we put in kind of this community, this culture that we find ourselves in, because we've achieved this level of academic and educational attainment. And sometimes we want to make sure the work we do validates that effort. I humbly believe that, because what I say about storytelling in particular, and with a lot of art, it's not hard. It's very simple. It's the stuff that people have been doing anyway. So, no, you didn't need a PhD to show the value of arts and health. You didn't need a master's. You just needed to be an artist. And there are so many people who are already capable of doing that, but never got the opportunity because of those pieces of paper that they never achieved, because of, again, the epistemology that so many of us in academia and I think within funding circles adhere to. That's the determination that you're smart enough or educated enough to tell me that there's something new that we can do within this space. Well, that's BS. We know these things are arbitrary in a lot of ways, and those are hurdles, for a lot of people in really integrating arts and public health. Is what we consider to be intelligence, what we consider to be knowledge that should be respected. So to me, yeah, it's ego more than anything else. It should not have taken this long. It didn't need to take Jill or Tasha or myself to show you all, or to show all people that art should have always been a part of health. There were so many artists before us that could have did it, but again, because of the ego that exists within these spaces, they never got the chance to show what could be. It took people who could merge both worlds to do that, and that's a shame, but I'm glad we're here nevertheless, because it'll make us better as a sector.
Great. Thank you. Tasha, did you want to add to that?
This isn't a primary barrier, but I'll add that there's also been, just functionally or pragmatically a lack of training on both sides. So a lack of training for researchers about how to understand the arts, or even, it's not researchers' fault necessarily if they haven't been taught to see that as being of epistemological value, or of being of value to their fields. That's a structural institutional thing. And on the other side, there's not a lot of trainings for artists to, for example, for me as a songwriter, just because I wrote songs about things like violence or mental illness doesn't mean that I was prepared to have people come and share their trauma stories with me, and doesn't mean that I could just be expected to hear that trauma story and respond appropriately in a way that was healthy for me or that person who confided in me. So there should be some ways for artists as well to, they don't have to be therapists or licensed therapists, but a way to get some grounding and certainty around, not even certainty, but some grounding and preparation for how to handle what might be sensitive topics and vulnerable people who might interact with you in these kinds of spaces.
That's great. And I think what you just shared is a great starter to a conversation about how to operationalize that intersection between arts and health as artists, with artists at the center and leading efforts at that intersection. I want to go back to you, David. And you kind of touched on this just in terms of like perceptions of value in a way. And I want to ask, what are your major or minor impediments to intense investment in arts, culture, and health? And right away, I'm thinking of systems of oppression. But I'll leave it to you to respond and hear what your thoughts are on that.
Okay. How much time we got?
I
know.
We have like 1 minute left. But
really? Oh, God.
I know.
I mean, yeah, it is about perception, and I think a lot of times it's about the messenger and not necessarily the message. So, yeah, we can talk about all systems of oppression that exist. So if this message was coming from a person of color, if this session was coming from a woman, if this session was coming from someone who's not Christian, we can talk about all those things that can be a minor reason why we don't take your message seriously. That stuff still exists. And because of how those things, those ways that people are constructed, their socio-demographics are connected to the outcomes and the opportunities that they may have, that I can't help but to think about the 1300 block of North Potomac Street in Baltimore, Maryland. That was the block I grew up on. And I can think about my friends and I can think about my contemporaries who are nowhere near the things that I've done in my life. And much of what drives me in the work that I do is what genius never got the chance to manifest. I can't be I know I'm not the only one. But because of the opportunities that I had, I get to talk to you all to share this truth. But who never got that chance? And that's what the systems of oppression have done and continue to do until we fully dismantle it. And when we talk about what's preventing us from having this intentional investment in the arts, it took this long for us to hear the message. And a lot of it had to do with the messengers who have shared that message. And unfortunately, we know that has a lot to do with how the manifestation of that message is shaped. And we know that's gotten us into some trouble because we've reached a wall as to what we get from it. So I can only hope and honestly pray that as those who are listening to us right now will open up their minds and their hearts, not just to us, but to other artists who can share this message in perhaps an even more powerful way than we can, and give them the opportunity to elevate their work, because art can save lives. Art does save lives. It always has and it always will. So let's give it the respect and the support that it always deserves.
That's great. Thank you. It is 2 minutes past the hour, so I know that folks probably will have to hop off now. There will be a recording, but I just want to ask one more question to all three of you as we close, kind of bringing us to the here and now, and offering final thoughts that funders who are on this webinar can leave with. So how have you seen COVID-19 create urgencies around the need to address the role of arts in public health, and what final message do you have to funders who are on the webinar today? It's for all of you.
Okay, so I'll go ahead. 2020 has been a year of revelation, and it's not to sound biblical or apocalyptic, but it's so true. It's revealed so much to us through this global pandemic, for which we all have a story, and through this uprising against oppression, which many of us have seen for the first time. It's truly opened our eyes. And particularly because of COVID-19 and the physical separation that hopefully many of us have adhered to this whole time, we have become reacquainted with how important relationships are and how important connection is. So even not being around people, even if you tolerate them, you can't stand them, whatever the case may be, not being around people has had an effect on us. And it's really urged us to appreciate those connections and those opportunities to just tell your story to somebody else, even if it's just how you're doing today. And I think that draws people again back to the arts. And not everybody considers themselves an artist, but we're all creative. And through our childhood, our adolescence, our adulthood, we exude creativity. And again, I think in the stillness and the silence of this moment, many of us have been reacquainted with that. So to funders, I say support that. Creativity breeds genius, and genius breeds creativity. So how many people are having their genius activated because of the stillness of this moment? And what can they do with that creativity? Well, they can save lives. It doesn't necessarily have to be with a guitar or with a djembe or whatever the case may be. But again, looking at these perspectives differently is making a difference in our world. So support it in any way that you can. Give people the opportunity to manifest their genius because it can save the world.
Awesome. Thank you. Go for it.
Yeah, this is Tasha. Thank you so much, David. I was going to say that one of my mantras all the time is that we can't heal what we can't talk about. And this word, talk about ability, is really important to my work and research and has been for a long time. I think that COVID-19 and the year 2020 in many ways have made things talk aboutable that people haven't found a way to express beforehand, and that's coming out in a lot of art and a lot of social movements and things like that. And of course, that's going to make people uncomfortable who would rather not talk about those things, but that's always the first step in healing of anything. Right. We can define healing in multiple ways. We can define talking in multiple ways, but we can't heal what we can't get out on the table, and arts and culture is so important for that. And as a final message to funders, I would say, like, if there's a barrier as far as like if I want arts and culture to influence health, how do I measure that? How do I do that in an evidence-based way? How do I ensure that that's a quote-unquote good use of our funds? These are all really legitimate questions, and I would just say as an encouragement, there are really great ways to do that. If you're concerned about a call for proposals and you're not sure what to require in those, there are a lot of people doing really great work that can provide you with some of those pragmatic details for moving the work forward. So if that's a barrier, no worries. There are people who are working on it. We'd happy to, probably any of us on this call, happy to try to point you in the right direction.
Excellent. Jamie, do you want to share anything before we hop off? All right.
Oh, is she muted?
Okay.
Oh no, sorry, I was muted.
Okay, go for it.
I'll just say super quickly, I agree 100% with everything Tasha and David have said, and I wrote a brief blog post about this in the spring when we were first introducing the COVID arts response resources, and just to say that, now there's a window. It sounds almost crass to talk about it as an opportunity, but the arts are having a moment, right? People are turning to the arts naturally now because they need them, right? That is part of what we do as humans in crisis, and I think. Like I said, without sounding like we're just being opportunistic, this is a chance for funders who are in positions of power, quite frankly, to start looking to do co-investments. Reach out to health funders in your community or at a national level or within your own institution, and try to create opportunities that are at this intersection. Use the research and the foundation that we've tried to build here. Point to that framework if they need to see it that way, but otherwise, sort of have confidence and know that on an intuitive level, like, people get this right now, and I think there's a huge opportunity to sort of just increase the support systems for this kind of work, because we know that artists are doing it. Everybody's out there doing it and feeling like they're doing it alone, but I think the more we create sort of systems and structures to support it, that'd be a way to continue to increase the visibility and really ultimately support communities in this time of crisis through the arts.
Great, thank you. I have so many thoughts and would love to keep talking for like another hour, but I realize we all have things to do. So I will wrap us up here and let folks know we are here at the end of our presentation. I want to thank you again, Tasha, David, and Jamie, for your excellent presentations. They were awesome. And you leave attendees with a lot to think about. You'll notice the contact information of our presenters is on the screen in front of you, and as they said, you could feel free to reach out to them and follow up to this presentation. If you have questions or you're looking for examples or folks that you are interested in connecting to. Today's presentation has been recorded, and we'll be sending you a link to the recording file and presentation slides within the next few days. And we also invite you to take a brief survey that we will share immediately following the webinar, and we would love to know what you thought. We hope you'll visit our website and keep the conversation going on how we can reimagine the future of philanthropy while keeping racial equity at the center. If you have any further questions, you can feel free to reach out to me, Sherilyn Seeley, and thank you for joining us on this GIA webinar. Have a great day, everyone.